They called her the quota pilot, a woman who didn't belong in a world of men, grit, and steel. Every dismissive glance, every cruel joke, and every silent moment of disrespect was a weight she carried with her into the cockpit. But beneath the stoic exterior of Sophie Hayes, a 29-year-old pilot who had survived more than just sandstorms, was a quiet fire. She wasn't fighting for their approval. She was fighting for a place she knew in her very soul she had earned. What happens when the only thing standing between a crew and disaster is the key person they'd all try to keep grounded? Just stay out of the way, sweetheart. We'll handle the real flying. The words were thrown into the cabin like a stone breaking glass. Every head in the helicopter turned towards Sophie Hayes, 29 years old, combat boots still dusty from the desert, the only woman in the Apache unit. She felt their eyes crawl over her, full of contempt, a little pity, and that unspoken judgment. Quota pilot. A box checked, a token, someone here to fill a line in the diversity report, not someone they trusted to keep them alive. She didn't flinch, but the words burrowed deep. When the commander collapsed in the middle of that flight, the world turned on its axis. Every pair of eyes swung back to her, not with pity this time, but with silent, dawning fear. Could she save them? Could she land this monster of a machine and in one single act crush all their sneering doubts? Hours earlier, Sophie had walked into the helicopter base for the first time, the scent of jet fuel sharp in her lungs, the desert sun leaving sweat between her shoulder blades. She was the newcomer, and the lone woman among a tight circle of Apache trainees who had long ago decided who did and didn't belong. The walls of the training room were a gallery of male faces, grinning beneath flight helmets, frozen in black and white glory. All men, a lieutenant said with a smirk, his gaze sliding down her frame like she was a joke only he understood. But hey, you'd make a great face for the recruitment posters. The laughter that followed was casual, careless, and sharp enough to cut. Each word pricked her skin like tiny needles. She felt her throat tighten with anger, but she swallowed it down, locking it behind her teeth. Her hand drifted to the cold metal of the pilot insignia pinned to her chest. The edges bit into her fingertips, hard, unyielding, like a reminder. You earned this. No one gave you permission. You don't need it. Training was an exercise in controlled humiliation. They stuck her in the co-pilot seat every session, never letting her take primary controls. She scribbled notes, observed, memorized every twitch of the dials and gauges. When a reflex exercise spun out of control and she offered a quick, logical solution, Captain Warren, the team leader with a jaw like chiseled stone and an ego to match, cut her off without a glance. Write it in your notebook. Here, we do real work. The words sat heavy in her chest, but Sophie said nothing. Her eyes stayed fixed on the temperature gauge, her silence its own rebellion. She burned with a quiet, coiled fury, the kind that made her want to grip the controls and show him. But she knew better. Not yet. The Apache would speak for her one day. At dinner, she chose a corner table, the dry mess hall sandwich turning to paste in her mouth as voices from nearby tables rose and fell, pointed just loud enough for her to hear. She graduated with honors from flight school, a young soldier said, half-heartedly defending her. Flight school's nothing, another scoffed. Real soldiers are rare. Someone else chimed in, loud enough to draw snickers. Hope she doesn't break a nail in the cockpit. What if she needs to touch up her lipstick mid-flight? Their laughter sliced through the air like spinning rotor blades. Every word was a knife, and she sat there, spine straight, jaw tight, chewing and swallowing their contempt along with the stale bread. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She just pressed her thumb against her pilot badge until it hurt. That night, alone in the barracks, Sophie finally let herself breathe. She rolled up her sleeve and traced the tattoo on her wrist, a single bird wing, delicate and sharp. Among pilots, it was a quiet badge of survival, the mark of someone who had walked the edge of death and come back. Her fingertip lingered on it, and with it came a flood of memory. The spinning sky, the deafening silence after a near-fatal stall, the moment she swore she'd never let fear own her again. Her father's voice rose in her mind, calm and commanding, as if he were standing in the dark with her. Stay calm, Sophie. Trust what you've learned. He had been a strict flight instructor, unrelenting in the cockpit, and she had loved him for it. Losing him at 16, when a training accident stole him from the sky, had nearly broken her. But his lessons had been branded into her bones. True strength doesn't roar. It endures. It waits. She wasn't here to beg for respect. She wasn't here to prove a point. She was here because flying was in her blood. Because the Apache cockpit felt like home in a way no room, no city, no person ever had. Tomorrow would bring another day of sidelong glances, cutting jokes, and that suffocating sense of being a mascot instead of a pilot. But Sophie Hayes had walked through worse storms than their prejudice. She'd survived grief, isolation, and the quiet cruelty of always being the only woman in the room. And she would survive this. Because eagles don't ask permission to fly. They simply stretch their wings and claim the sky that already belongs to them. She lay back on the narrow bunk, tracing the inked wing on her wrist one last time, her heartbeat steadying. Somewhere out there, tomorrow's mission waited, the one that would burn away every doubt, every whisper of quota pilot, and leave only truth in its wake. For now, she closed her eyes and prepared for the morning. Under the endless Arizona sun, the desert sprawled out in a heat-shimmering haze, the sky a flawless sheet of blue. For Sophie Hayes, this wasn't just another training exercise. It was another battle in the lifelong war to prove she belonged here. 4 helicopters sliced through the sky in tight formation, their rotors carving rhythmic thunder into the air. Sophie sat in the co-pilot seat of Team 2, side by side with Captain Warren. The warmth of the sun and the gentle sway of the helicopter might have felt peaceful to anyone else, but Sophie's chest was tight with the weight of silent judgment. Warren leaned back slightly, his tone dripping with mockery as he quipped, "If something goes wrong, at least you can make iced tea, right?" The words struck her like cold water, but her face remained unreadable, her jaw locked in discipline. She didn't grant him the satisfaction of her response. Instead, her sharp eyes tracked the instrument panel, scanning every flicker of every gauge, every subtle hum or tremor that might betray danger. Years of obsessive attention to detail, born of discipline and her father's relentless lessons, kept her alert. There, a whisper of trouble. The engine temperature had begun to creep beyond the safe threshold. It was the kind of shift that a distracted pilot might miss, but Sophie saw it instantly. Her voice was calm but firm. "Captain, engine temperature's rising above normal." Warren barely glanced at her. With a casual flick of his hand, he waved off the warning. "Relax, sweetheart. I've been flying these birds since before you knew what a helicopter was." The air in the cabin grew heavy, thick with tension and unspoken dismissal. Sophie felt the familiar weight of every doubt, every sneer, every unspoken, "You don't belong here," pressing down on her shoulders. Then the desert betrayed them. Without warning, a wall of sand roared across the horizon. One second, the sky was a bright, endless blue. The next, it turned the color of coffee, churning and opaque. A sudden sandstorm slammed into the formation with invisible fists. The helicopter bucked violently, shuddering like a wounded animal. Rotor blades screamed against the wind, and the frame groaned under the stress. Warren wrestled with the controls, his knuckles bone-white, beads of sweat rolling down his forehead despite the blast of the air conditioning. The crew clutched their seats, bracing against the violent pitch and roll. The storm swallowed the horizon, leaving them blind in a whirl of dust and noise. Then everything shattered. A strangled sound tore from Warren's throat. His body stiffened, convulsed, eyes rolling back as his hands slid uselessly from the controls. A crushing heart attack. In an instant, the helicopter lurched into a deadly dive toward the unforgiving desert floor. Chaos exploded in the cabin. Warning alarms shrieked. Radios crackled with panicked voices. Someone screamed. The sound tore at Sophie's ears. But inside, something ancient and cold surged forward. A survival instinct sharpened by a lifetime of fighting to be heard. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, clear and unwavering. "Panic kills pilots faster than the machine ever will. Stay calm. Trust what you've learned." Sophie launched herself across the cabin, prying the controls from Warren's slack hands. Her pulse hammered like war drums, but her mind snapped into focus, each thought precise and deliberate. Fear was still there, but now it fueled her grip rather than froze her. The radio sputtered with alarm chatter. "Team 2 is dropping. What's happening?" No answer. Sophie didn't have the breath to speak. She was too busy dragging them back from the edge of death. She fell into the rhythm of every lesson her father had ever drilled into her. Zero visibility, feel the wind, trust the gauges. Her lips moved in a whisper, almost a prayer. Visibility, balance, wind direction. Her hands danced across the controls with practiced precision, fighting the storm as the descent slowed. Through the spinning haze of sand, she caught a glimpse of jagged canyon rock racing toward them. One wrong move, 1 second of hesitation, and they would be shin. Sophie banked hard left, her muscles straining against the stick. The helicopter groaned in protest but obeyed. The cliff face slip had passed, missing them by mere feet. Her hands shook, but her eyes never wavered from the artificial horizon, the only lifeline in the world where the real one had disappeared. Far behind, the other crews could only watch the storm swallow Team 2 whole. Radio silence, no visual, empty sky where their friends had been seconds ago. Then, like a phantom, the helicopter emerged from the churning dust. Steady, controlled. Sophie Hayes at the helm, pale but unbroken, her face a mask of determination. Sweat stung her eyes, mingling with tears she hadn't realized had fallen. Every muscle in Sophie's body screamed in protest, as if every nerve had been lit on fire from the battle against the helicopter. Her arms trembled, her shoulders burned, but she'd done it. Against every doubt, against the storm that wanted to swallow them whole, she had saved not only Captain Warren's life, but the lives of every soul aboard. The radio crackled to life, sharp against the ringing in her ears. Team 2, this is base command. Report your status immediately. Sophie's fingers fumbled over the mic. Her hands were still shaking so hard she could barely hold it down. Base command, this is Team 2. We're okay. Captain Warren suffered a medical emergency, requesting immediate medical evacuation. A brief silence followed, and then the reply came, firm and clear. Copy that, Team 2. Outstanding work. Pilot, outstanding work. The words seemed to echo in the cabin, a weight she had been carrying for years finally shifting, just a fraction. She guided the Apache toward the emergency landing zone, eyes flicking to the thin line of her birdwing tattoo on her wrist. That ink had once been nothing more than a reminder that she had survived a fall, a private symbol of stubbornness and survival. But now it was proof of something bigger. Some people weren't just meant to survive. They were born to fly through storms. The other helicopters in formation held their distance, watching in silent disbelief. The woman they'd mocked, the one they'd dismissed as a joke, was executing a textbook emergency landing, one even the most seasoned pilots would struggle to pull off. When the rotors finally spun to a stop, the desert wrapped them in a heavy, wind-whipped silence. Only the distant rumble of approaching medical vehicles broke it. Sophie sat frozen in the pilot's seat, her hands still gripping the controls like they were the only solid thing left in the world. Out beyond the nose of the helicopter, the sandstorm was breaking apart, the sun cutting through the haze in pale, trembling rays. She hadn't just landed a helicopter. She had landed years of doubt, of whispered jokes and dismissive stares. Respect, the kind she had been fighting for every day of her career, had finally touched down with her. But she knew the real test would come back at base, when she faced the same men who had written her off, now forced to recognize what she had done. And yet, somewhere deep in her chest, she already knew something had shifted forever. It wasn't just about how they saw her, it was about how she saw herself. She was done asking for permission to be here. She had carved her place in the sky with her own hands. The helicopter settled at the emergency rally point with the precision of a surgeon stitching a life back together. The engines coughed to silence, leaving only the desert wind. Medical personnel sprinted across the landing zone, boots crunching against the sand. A flight medic clambered into the cabin and knelt beside Warren, his hands already checking for a pulse. He's breathing, the medic called, voice taut with urgency. Pulse is weak, but steady. Massive coronary event. He's lucky to be alive. We need to move now. They worked quickly, lifting Warren onto a stretcher and securing him into the medevac helicopter. Sophie watched from her seat, her heartbeat still pounding in her throat. Dust swirled around the landing zone as the medics lifted off, carrying her team leader into the sky. Then the other pilots approached. Their boots kicked up sand as they walked toward her, faces a mixture of awe and something she'd never seen directed at her before, genuine respect. Lieutenant Rodriguez, the same man who'd cracked a joke about her nails just hours ago, was the first to speak. His voice was soft, almost reverent. You, you just saved their lives. All of them. Sophie shook her head, her legs still trembling from adrenaline. I just did what needed to be done. But even as the words left her mouth, she felt the truth settle in her chest. Something fundamental had changed. The way they looked at her now wasn't pity, it wasn't skepticism. It was the look pilots gave to another pilot who had earned her place under fire. By the time the formation returned to base, the story had already outrun her. News of Sophie's landing tore through the hangars like wildfire. Mechanics abandoned their tools to shake her hand. Ground crews who used to ignore her nodded as she passed. A few even clapped quietly, as if afraid to break the spell. Some asked to see the flight data from her emergency maneuvers, eager to understand how she had done what she did. The following day brought something Sophie could never have imagined, an official summons to the simulator room. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez himself requested that she walk the entire senior staff through her emergency sequence, step by step. The simulator chamber felt less like a training space and more like a courtroom where she was finally standing trial, not for failure, but for the right to belong. The entire row of senior officers watched in silence as the screens came alive, recreating the storm, the warnings, the crisis. Sophie's voice stayed steady as she narrated each choice she had made. She explained how she noticed the engine temperature spike Warren had dismissed, how every decision afterward had been a calculation of risk and instinct, a thread of life pulled tight in the storm, and for the first time in her career, every eye in the room followed her not with doubt, but with respect. She had calculated the wind shear, accounted for the near-zero visibility, and used terrain avoidance radar to weave through the canyon walls like a ghost in the dark. Every maneuver was precise, measured, almost instinctive. Not once did she hesitate, not once did her hands betray a tremor. When the simulation ended, there was a brief, stunned silence. Then the room erupted into spontaneous applause. It was a first. In the 30-year history of the base, no one had ever received that kind of reaction. Lieutenant Colonel Martinez rose to his feet, his voice cutting through the din. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his tone carrying a rare note of pride, what you just witnessed was textbook emergency aviation. Flawless from start to finish. That, he paused, scanning the room, is how it's supposed to be done. The whispers in the hallway shifted almost immediately. The quiet judgments and muttered doubts that had followed Sophie Hayes since the day she arrived evaporated, replaced with something that sounded suspiciously like respect. I used to think she was just here to fill a quota, Sergeant Kim admitted in the mess hall later, his voice gruff but sincere. He'd been one of her harshest critics. I owe her an apology. Another pilot, who had never missed a chance to question her place among them, muttered into his coffee, we should have given her a real chance from day one. We were idiots. 3 days later, Captain Warren opened his eyes in the military hospital. The sterile room hummed with the soft rhythm of machines, a distant drip of IV fluid. When the doctors told him that Sophie had been the one to bring his crew home, he didn't speak. He just stared at the ceiling for a long, long moment, as if replaying everything he thought he knew about her and about himself. That afternoon, he asked to see her. Sophie entered the hospital room to find Warren propped up against a mound of pillows, looking smaller than she had ever seen him. The man who had always carried himself with unshakable authority now seemed fragile, surrounded by softly beeping monitors and the faint antiseptic smell of the ward. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, they weren't filled with arrogance or skepticism. They held something else, something heavy and human. Regret, humility, and the raw edge of gratitude. Hayes, he said quietly, his voice rough from the breathing tube. I need to say something. Out of habit, Sophie stood at attention. Warren gave a faint shake of his head. Sit down, please. She took the chair beside his bed, folding her hands in her lap, waiting. I was wrong. The words escaped like a confession he had been holding for years. About everything, about you, about what I thought flying meant. He paused to draw in a careful breath. When I woke up and they told me that you were the one flying us home, his voice cracked just for a moment. You did something up there I couldn't have done. Not on my best day. Maybe not ever. He reached toward the bedside table and picked up a small object. When he extended his hand, it wasn't for a handshake. Resting in his palm was a simple steel keychain shaped like Apache rotor blades. This belonged to my flight instructor 20 years ago, Warren said, his gaze locking with hers. He gave it to me when I earned my wings. You earned this more than I ever did. Sophie accepted the keychain, feeling the cool weight of the metal press into her skin. It was more than a token, it was acknowledgement. Respect. A silent acceptance that no ceremony could ever grant. Thank you, sir, she said softly. Don't thank me, Warren murmured, his voice tired but steady. You earned every bit of this, and more. When Sophie walked out of the hospital into the late afternoon sun, her fingers curled around the keychain in her pocket. The metal was warm now, but the warmth that spread through her was something deeper. For years, a voice in the back of her mind had whispered that maybe they were right. Maybe she didn't belong. That voice was silent now. She belonged. Not because anyone said so, not because she'd been tolerated or allowed to stand among them, but because when it mattered most, with lives on the line and no margin for error, she had done what needed to be done. Skill had no gender. When she returned to the base, a new assignment waited on her desk. Team leader for advanced combat training. For the first time in her career, when Sophie stepped into the helicopter as pilot in command, no one looked at her sideways. No whispered doubts followed her. No questions hung in the air about whether she deserved the seat. There was only the quiet, unspoken trust of a crew that had seen her bring soldiers home when death had been a breath away. She ran her fingers over the checklist, calm and deliberate, and as her eyes passed over her wrist, she caught the faint curve of the birdwing tattoo. Once it had only meant survival, a reminder that she had walked away from a fall. Now it meant more. It meant rising above everything that had tried to keep her grounded. The Apache's engines roared to life, vibrating through the metal frame, and for the first time in her career, Sophie Hayes felt exactly what she had been fighting for all along: freedom. Sophie Hayes had always carried a simple, undeniable truth in her chest. She belonged in the sky. A week after the desert mission, the official orders came. She was being promoted to commanding pilot of a new Apache crew. The change wasn't just a new title on paper, it rippled through everything around her. When she walked through the base now, conversations didn't stop mid-sentence. Eyes didn't linger with that quiet mix of doubt and judgment she'd grown used to. She wasn't the oddity anymore. She wasn't the woman who had to prove she deserved the flight suit. She was what she had always been, only now the world finally recognized it. Just another pilot doing her job. One morning, Sophie opened her locker and froze. Resting on the shelf was a small package she hadn't expected. Inside lay a solid steel keychain, shaped like the spinning blades of an Apache, its edges catching the fluorescent light. A folded note rested beside it in Captain Warren's careful, deliberate handwriting. You earned this. Sophie turned the keychain in her palm, feeling its weight press into her skin. It wasn't just a piece of metal. It was proof that the respect she'd bled and fought for wasn't a temporary nod or a polite courtesy. It was hers now, forged in the fire of crisis and sealed by survival. When she climbed into the cockpit for her first official flight as crew commander, everything felt different. The Apache no longer seemed like enemy territory she had to conquer. It welcomed her like a home she had built with her own hands. In the co-pilot seat sat a young, fresh-faced officer, Lieutenant Davis, straight out of flight school. His posture was straight, his helmet tucked under one arm, and his expression carried none of the skepticism she'd seen in other men just weeks ago. Ma'am, he said as she ran through the pre-flight checklist, his voice steady but tinged with awe. I heard about what happened in the desert, about what you did. He hesitated, searching for the right words. I used to think passing the flight exam was the hardest thing I'd ever do. But you showed me that's just the beginning. Sophie glanced at him, catching the earnest respect in his eyes. It was the kind that couldn't be faked. Flying isn't about proving you're the best pilot in the room, Lieutenant, she said quietly. It's about bringing everyone home safe. The rotors roared to life, and moments later, they were rising into the sharp, cloudless Arizona sky. For the first time in her military career, Sophie felt an unshakable sense of belonging, not just in the helicopter, but in the air itself. The aircraft moved under her touch like an extension of her own body, each shift and response as natural as breathing. Her voice over the comms was steady, and every order she gave was met with immediate, precise action. No hesitation, no second guessing. No jokes about her nails or her place on the team. They followed her because they trusted her, and she led with the calm certainty of somebody who had nothing left to prove. During the training exercise, every maneuver flowed seamlessly. When she issued instructions, the crew responded like a single machine. And for the first time, she realized this was what it meant to truly be a leader. Not loud, not forceful, just quietly, unquestionably in command. After landing, Sophie ran her post-flight inspection with practiced efficiency. Lieutenant Davis approached, his helmet tucked against his ribs. "Ma'am," he said, a grin slipping through his formal tone. Some of the guys from other crews were asking, "Would you consider teaching a master class on emergency procedures? Word spreading about your technique." Sophie blinked. "They want me to teach them?" "Yes, ma'am. Apparently someone recorded your simulation run. It's already making the rounds as required viewing for all new Apache pilots." He hesitated, then added with a hint of pride, "They're calling it the Hayes Protocol now." For a moment, Sophie couldn't answer. She glanced down at her wrist, where the small bird-wing tattoo caught the desert light. Years ago, she'd gotten it after surviving her first major flight emergency, a trembling reminder that she had fallen and lived. Now, the ink meant something else entirely. It wasn't about surviving anymore. It was about soaring. That evening, as she updated her flight log, Sophie let herself sit in the quiet and take in how far she'd come. Her journey wasn't measured only in rank or new responsibilities. It was written in the quiet confidence that settles in after you've proved yourself when it matters most. She didn't need to fight for respect anymore. She didn't need to argue or defend her place in the sky. Her actions had already said everything that needed to be said. In her desk drawer, she kept two things side by side: Warren's steel keychain and a weathered photograph of her father in his flight suit. One represented the man who had first taught her to fly. The other, the man who had finally acknowledged she belonged in the air. Together, they told the story of the road she had taken to get here. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new challenges, and new skies to claim. Sophie Hayes knew now, with a certainty that would never leave her. Skill had no gender, and courage had no boundaries. Sophie Hayes finally allowed herself to rest that night, the kind of rest that came with knowing she had claimed her place in the sky, not because of favoritism, not because of quotas, but by the only currency that truly mattered in aviation: the ability to bring her team home alive. People had called her names before, words that didn't belong to her, simply because they hadn't seen the real Sophie yet. She never argued back. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to throw her rank or her anger around to be recognized. Her hands spoke for her. The steady way she gripped the controls, the sharp instincts honed by endless training, the unshakable calm she carried into storms and gunfire. Those were her answers. Half a year later, Fort Hunter Lyot was a different place. There had been no new policies, no sweeping speeches about diversity, no official memos proclaiming change. The base had transformed because one woman had refused to break under the weight of doubt and ridicule. She'd held her ground when everyone expected her to falter. And because she stood firm, the ground itself seemed to shift. New recruits began arriving for Apache training, young women with fresh eyes and nerves of steel, or at least the beginnings of them. They would hear the whispers almost immediately, passed between barracks like campfire legends, about the pilot who had saved her entire crew in the middle of a sandstorm. Some thought it was a tall tale, just another story soldiers told to fill long nights, until they saw her in the flesh. Sophie Hayes walking across the sun-baked tarmac with quiet confidence, as if she'd always belonged there, in a world that had once made it clear she didn't. Captain Sarah Chen was one of the first to approach her. Fresh out of flight school, still wearing the eagerness of the new and untested, she caught Sophie after a long day of maintenance checks. "Ma'am," she said almost shyly, "the other women pilots and we wanted to thank you for making this possible." Sophie looked up from the grease-streaked maintenance report in her hands. Her voice was steady, her gaze soft but unwavering. "I didn't make anything possible," she said. "I just refused to make it impossible." Her finger brushed the edge of the birdwing tattoo inked on her forearm. Its colors faded from years of sun, sand, and hard work. "This isn't about me, Captain," she added. "It's about everyone who comes after." By then, the Hayes Protocol, the emergency maneuver she had improvised during that life-or-death mission, had been adopted as standard training at multiple bases. Flight instructors referenced her procedures as a textbook example of crisis management. Her simulation recordings were studied by pilots in every branch of service. Yet Sophie never chased the spotlight. She flew her missions. She trained the next generation. She ran her post-flight checks with the same quiet diligence she had on her first day. Captain Warren, once the man who had dismissed her as a liability, now often watched her during exercises. Fully recovered and back on active duty, he had come to speak of her with a respect that was almost reverent. One afternoon, he told his aide, "She's the finest pilot I've ever served with, and I'm damn grateful she gave me a second chance to see that." In a world that had long equated respect with rank, volume, and brute strength, Sophie proved that true honor didn't roar. It arrived in the form of steady hands, decisive choices, and the courage to act when it mattered most. Her story didn't spread through headlines or official commendations. It traveled in low, earnest conversations between soldiers, people who knew the taste of fear, the cost of mistakes, and the weight of courage. Young pilots, men and women alike, would sometimes glance toward the hangars when doubt crept in, seeking a glimpse of the woman with the birdwing tattoo. They weren't looking for sympathy or special treatment. They were looking for proof that some battles were worth fighting and some barriers could be broken quietly, without fanfare. Sophie Hayes had done more than earn her wings. She had earned something rarer, something the military couldn't pin on a uniform. She had earned the quiet, enduring respect that only comes from standing unshaken in the face of everything meant to break you.